I never imagined I would remarry, but then Nathaniel came into my life like a warm breeze after a long, harsh winter. He was everything my first husband wasn't: kind, dependable, and committed. Nathaniel had a gentle strength, the kind that made you feel like you were finally safe, finally home. He wasn't flashy or extravagant. Instead, he had a quiet confidence that made me trust him instantly. He listened when I spoke, really listened, as if my words mattered more than anything else in that moment. He made me laugh without trying too hard, and when he held me, I felt like the weight of my past, the loneliness, and the heartache were no longer mine to bear alone. Our life together wasn't perfect, but it had a sense of stability that I had craved for so long. We built a home that felt lived in, where the walls were lined with memories, laughter, and shared moments that seemed to stitch us together. Nathaniel loved cooking, and our kitchen had become the heart of our home. On Saturday mornings, I'd watch him move effortlessly around the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, humming a tune as he flipped pancakes or stirred a pot of rich tomato sauce. There was something incredibly comforting in those small rituals: the warmth of the stove, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, and Nathaniel's soft, reassuring presence. We spent evenings on our back porch, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, talking about everything and nothing at all. He would hold my hand, and we'd sit there in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. It wasn't that our life was free from problems. We had our disagreements, our moments of frustration, but there was an underlying steadiness to it all. Even when we argued, Nathaniel never raised his voice. He would listen, his brows furrowed in thought, and when he spoke, his words were careful, considerate, always seeking to understand. I loved the life we had built together. It wasn't grand, it wasn't the stuff of fairy tales, but it was real, and it was ours. I loved the mornings spent sipping coffee in our sunlit kitchen, the soft rustle of newspapers, the gentle banter. I loved how we shared chores, how Nathaniel would do the dishes without me asking, and how he'd leave little notes for me on the refrigerator, reminding me to pick up milk or just telling me he loved me. I loved the steadiness of it all, the way he made me feel like I could lean on him without fear, the way he wrapped me in his arms each night, as if to say that no matter what happened, we'd face it together. Nathaniel filled a void in my life that I hadn't even realized was there. He made me believe in love again, not the whirlwind, passionate kind I'd read about in novels, but the kind that grows slowly, like a tree, roots digging deep into the earth, branches reaching towards the sky. It was a love that was steadfast, resilient, one that held me when the world felt like it was spinning out of control. It wasn't perfect, but it was the kind of love that made me feel whole again, and for that, I was endlessly grateful. What I hadn't anticipated was how complex my relationship with Nathaniel's son, Josh, would become. Josh was 15 when I entered his life, reserved and distant. I remember our first interaction so clearly, the way he avoided my gaze, his body language stiff and withdrawn. He had a lanky frame back then, with shaggy dark hair that often fell across his eyes, shielding his expressions from the world. His voice was quiet, and his words clipped, as if he didn't want to waste any on me. I tried my best to give him space, to let him warm up to me on his own terms, but the distance between us felt like a chasm I wasn't sure how to bridge. Over the years, our relationship settled into something polite, but somewhat detached. We were cordial to one another, our conversations limited to casual exchanges about his school day or what he wanted for dinner. I would ask him about his interests, and he would give me brief, non-committal answers, never really letting me in. We coexisted like housemates who had simply learned to tolerate each other's presence. I thought that was the best we could hope for, mutual respect without any genuine warmth. It wasn't overly strained, but it was far from what one might call familial. But then something began to change. Josh grew up. He transformed from a gangly teenager into a tall, well-built young man seemingly overnight. His features sharpened, and the awkwardness of his adolescence melted away, leaving behind a young man who moved with a new confidence. His hair, once always in his eyes, was now neatly styled back, revealing the intense grey eyes that had once been so guarded. Those eyes now seemed to hold a quiet depth, an understanding that hadn't been there before. Suddenly, I began to notice more about him. He had a way of speaking that drew you in, his voice deeper and more resonant now. He had this effortless charm, a calmness that made him seem wise beyond his years. When he laughed, it was no longer that restrained, self-conscious chuckle from his teenage days. It was a rich, genuine sound that filled the room and made me smile despite myself. He became attentive, listening to me in a way that made me feel truly heard, something I hadn't realized I missed so much. I remember one particular evening vividly. Nathaniel was away on one of his business trips, and it was just the two of us at home. We were in the living room watching an old comedy. At first, it was innocent enough, laughing at the silly jokes, sharing popcorn, but at some point, I glanced over at him, and what I saw startled me. He wasn't just watching the movie, he was watching me, his eyes soft, a faint smile playing on his lips. There was something in that look, something vulnerable, something raw, that caught me off guard. It made my heart skip a beat, and I felt my face grow warm. For a moment, it was as if time slowed, and the room shrank until it was just the two of us, suspended in that fleeting moment of connection. Nathaniel's frequent travels for work meant that Josh and I spent more time alone together. What started out as simple evenings, dinner and a movie, became something more. We started cooking meals together, laughing as we fumbled our way through recipes, making a mess in the kitchen and turning simple tasks into moments of shared joy. I noticed how his presence seemed to fill the space, how his laughter was infectious, and how his gaze would linger on me, making my pulse quicken. Our conversations grew deeper, more meaningful. He began to open up to me about his worries and his dreams, things he had never shared before. He talked about wanting to travel, to experience the world beyond the boundaries of our small bubble. I told him stories about my own younger years, my own aspirations before life had taken a different path. The more we talked, the more I found myself drawn to him, not as a stepson, but as a person with his own hopes and fears. I began to see Josh not as the awkward teenager I had met years ago, but as a man who was attentive, caring, and who made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. There were moments when our hands would accidentally brush while passing a dish or reaching for something, and the electric charge that sparked between us was impossible to ignore. I could feel it in the way my heart would race, the way I would catch myself holding my breath, waiting for something I couldn't quite name. It scared me, the intensity of it, the way my feelings were shifting. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, but the evidence was there in the way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to soften when they met mine, as if I was the only person that mattered in that moment. And the truth was, I felt the same. I wanted to push it away, to tell myself it was wrong, but it was as if a magnet was pulling us closer, and I couldn't resist it. I remember that one evening vividly. We were sitting on the couch, the room dimly lit by a soft golden glow from the lamps, creating an almost intimate cocoon around us. The curtains were drawn, and the rain outside tapped gently against the windows, giving the evening a cozy feeling. Josh and I were talking, our conversation flowing easily, each of us nursing a glass of wine. I could see the flickering light from the TV reflecting in his eyes, and there was something about the way he looked at me that night that felt different, more intense, more sincere. The wine had relaxed us both, loosening our usual boundaries, allowing us to speak more freely. He leaned in slightly as he spoke, his voice low and smooth, and I could see the lines of his face clearly, his strong jaw, his full lips that curled into a hesitant smile whenever he was about to say something personal. I found myself laughing more than usual, feeling lighter, more at ease. There was a warmth that radiated between us, and I could feel it, like an invisible thread drawing us closer, connecting us in a way that was both exciting and terrifying. Then, out of nowhere, Josh's demeanor shifted. He grew quieter, his eyes searching mine, as if he was trying to find the courage to say something. He took a deep breath, and I could see his fingers tightening slightly around his wine glass. That's when he spoke the words that shattered the delicate balance we had built. "Helen, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice a little shaky, almost breaking. I have feelings for you." My heart stopped. Time seemed to slow down, and the room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker, pressing in on me from all sides. I had no idea how to respond. This was Josh, my stepson, a relationship that should be clearly defined, clearly untouchable. But there was something in the way he looked at me, his eyes filled with vulnerability, with hope, that made me feel something deep inside. Something I hadn't felt in years. Seen. Desired. The kind of desire that made my skin tingle, that made my heart pound in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The connection between us, once subtle and easy to ignore, now felt undeniable, like a current running beneath my skin. I could feel my throat tightening, my breath catching as I tried to form words. "Josh, we can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling. But even as I said it, I knew my words lacked conviction. My mind was telling me that this was wrong, that this couldn't happen, But my heart was betraying me, wanting something different. Josh's eyes searched mine, as if he was hoping I might change my answer, that I might say something else, something that would give him hope. He opened his mouth to speak, but before either of us could say anything more, the front door opened. The sound of keys jingling, the door creaking. It was Nathaniel. He was home early from his trip, his voice calling out cheerfully, blissfully unaware of the tension that had just been broken. I quickly pulled away, setting my wine glass down on the coffee table, my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline rushing through my veins. I couldn't bring myself to look at Josh, couldn't bear to see the expression on his face. I could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me, the guilt, the confusion, the fear. Nathaniel walked in, smiling, oblivious, and I forced a smile back, my stomach churning, the room suddenly feeling too warm, too close. The rest of the evening passed in uneasy silence. Josh barely spoke, and I did my best to avoid his gaze, to pretend that nothing had happened, that everything was normal. But the weight of his confession lingered, heavy in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Every time I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye, my heart would skip a beat, and I'd have to look away, afraid that Nathaniel might see the truth written on my face. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the way Josh had looked at me, the way his voice had trembled, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. I knew I shouldn't feel this way, that it was wrong, but I couldn't help it. There was something between us, something real, something that scared me as much as it excited me. I finally gave up on sleep, slipping out of bed and padding softly down the stairs, needing something. Air, space, clarity. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I walked into the kitchen, hoping for some kind of solace, some kind of answer, and that's when I saw him. Josh. He was standing by the window, his silhouette outlined by the silvery glow of the moon. He turned when he heard me, his face shadowed with regret, but his eyes still held that intensity, that same longing that made my heart ache. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. I could feel my heart pounding, my throat tightening as I struggled to find the words. But before I could say anything, Josh spoke, his voice low, almost pleading. I need to tell you the truth, he said, his eyes locking onto mine, filled with something raw, something that made my chest tighten. What is it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my heart pounding. There's something you don't know, he said, and his words hung heavy in the air, each one like a weight pressing down on me. Dad's been lying to you, he continued, his tone deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. He's been seeing someone else during his work trips. I found out months ago. It felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath me. My marriage, the foundation of my life, suddenly felt like a lie, crumbling beneath my feet. Josh's words echoed in my mind, and for the first time, I questioned everything I thought I knew. The betrayal, the hurt, the confusion, it all crashed over me in waves, and I felt like I was drowning, unable to catch my breath. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice shaking, barely more than a whisper. I didn't want to hurt you, Josh replied, his voice raw, filled with emotion. But when I saw how distant Dad had become, I couldn't just stand by. You deserve better than this. My mind raced, torn between the betrayal I felt from Nathaniel and the growing closeness I couldn't ignore with Josh. I had always believed there were clear boundaries, lines that should never be crossed. But now those lines were blurring, and I no longer knew what was right, what was wrong. Josh took a step closer, his hand reaching out to take mine, his touch soft but filled with intensity. I didn't plan this, Helen, he said, his voice almost breaking. I didn't plan to fall for you. And in that moment, standing there in the moonlit kitchen, I knew I had a choice to make. I could turn away, cling to the broken remains of my marriage, or I could face the truth of what had been growing between Josh and me. The weight of that decision pressed down on me, almost suffocating, but deep down, my heart knew what it wanted. In the stillness of the kitchen, with the moonlight casting its glow around us, I whispered, yes.